I sneaked something clever into the design of this build, and to keep things short and sweet for this intro, it'll either work or it'll be dangerous. But there's no turning back now, so let's build the nicest and potentially most hazardous mallet you've ever seen.
I broke my mallet years ago.
And it's probably a better time than any to make an extremely nice one. From the get-go, I'll be frank with you. I've watched a lot of woodworking YouTube videos over the last few years. And all of the mallet videos that I've seen are good, but they're not like really good. No doubt, people are extremely creative, but I feel like they don't really take it to the next level. Which makes sense for the average woodworker. A mallet is a mallet, and you don't really need to take it to the next level. But if you've been a long-time viewer, you definitely know that Fortress takes it to the extreme. So as I briefly mentioned in the intro, I added a secret design aspect to this that'll definitely make it different than the rest. Not only that, but every piece of this will have complicated accents, textures, and colors. These are the two mallet head blanks, and we'll figure out why there's two later on, but we're going to set them aside for now. This is B-grade ebony, and I've had it for about 6 years ever since I built instruments, and this will be the first accent that I deal with, which will be the bottom of the handle, but instead of just joining it straight, I'm joining it at an angle. These angles will start to play a larger role in the overall design, but you'll actually see as we progress, I'm choosing very carefully how I do this joint. At first glance, it looks like I'm just gluing two boards together at an angle, whoop-de-doo. And I actually kind of am right now. So why am I not using a floating tenon or any other type of joinery here? And you might actually say because it's strong enough by itself, and very likely it could be. But if you perfected this joint and had a successful glue up, there is a high chance that if you tried to break it in the future, it wouldn't break. So with that all said, what is my plan?
All right, so that joint came out perfect. A scarf joint by itself isn't that strong, but I have a secret to making this a lot stronger, and I'll show you. So I used to build custom guitars, and this is one of them. But the important aspect is that there is a scarf joint connecting the headstock to the neck. And this joint by itself would be fairly weak, but notice how the fingerboard keeps the joint captive, and that's what makes it so strong. And that's exactly what I'm going to do with this joint. I'm going to add 2 pieces of ebony on the outside, which will keep this captive, but I'll do that in a later step.
So a traditional woodworking mallet is built a little bit differently than how I'm going to build this one. Normally on the inside of the mallet, you'll see the tenon go all the way through to the top with a wedge hammered in to widen that top section and lock it in. And that wedged tenon that I just showed you is very similar to a joint you probably already know, the dovetail. So that kind of raises a question, why am I not doing the traditional joinery? And I surprisingly have a few good answers. First, I needed a shorter joint so that it wouldn't come out the top of the mallet because I'm going to be inserting something there. Second, the end of this dovetail will actually play a role in how all of this works. There's honestly a lot of different ways to do this next step, and that's what I love about woodworking, is there's multiple ways to do everything. But wow, all I can say is wow, this method is so incredibly accurate, I didn't even have to fine-tune the mortise at all. And we actually spend a lot of time making dedicated videos for Patreon that go over details just like this. For this project alone, there's over 10 videos averaging 10 minutes each that go over some of the complicated aspects of each part of this build. So check it out if you like to learn.
This is exactly why I need the mallet, because I've been using this rubber one for literal years now.
If you haven't had the satisfying experience of making a perfect joint, then you're really missing out. The best I can describe it, although probably doesn't do it justice, is peeling off that protective film off of something new, or maybe the satisfying feeling of snapping that tricky puzzle piece in that you just spent the last 10 minutes on. I mean, who knows? For you it might be getting that perfect snipe shot in that video game your wife doesn't want you to play all the time, when we all know you should be doing dishes. But she doesn't realize how much it makes you happy, and that's what truly counts, right? Dishes aren't satisfying, so you can tell her that I gave you permission.
No glue required. That thing is on there.
Back to finishing the handle. Instead of having just normal straight sides, I'm going to add a little bit of curve, which will make adding the fish fillets on the outside a lot more interesting. Because since a fish's profile is already curved, it'll actually match this already and I won't even have to do anything. Or if you were listening very carefully in the beginning, I'm actually going to be putting ebony on the outside of these. The thickness of these are about an 1/8 inch or 3 millimeters, and that's so they can actually conform to the curve. Ebony is extremely stiff, so even if I made these a 1/4 inch, which isn't that much thicker, it would be really hard to clamp them in place. I know there's different groups of people out there where some of them like hand tools only and some of them like power tools only. And I'm definitely somewhere in between. For instance, this hand plane is having a really hard time cutting through the ebony, so I would have no guilt putting it through the drum sander and having it do the job perfectly. But as a creator, I think it's important for me to show you that there's a satisfying part of using hand tools and power tools. And just because they used to do everything by hand and probably take years to make one project, that definitely doesn't mean you or I have to be shackled to one thing or another. I will say this though, see how this freshly sharpened chisel is having a hard time cutting through the ebony? And even this flush trim saw is going really slow considering how tiny this piece is. I might as well be cutting stone at this point, but that carbide tip bandsaw blade I was using didn't even realize it was ebony. For all it knew, it was cutting a warm stick of butter. And that's just my point. We have come up with amazing technology in woodworking. If you think about it, the time-saving features of all the tools we have now is just insanity. It probably used to take one full day to mill a board to size, thickness, and length, or at least that's how long it would have taken me, for sure. And that alone is why I'm perfectly fine with hybrid woodworking. As we get into the more complex parts of how this mallet is designed, we're going to be switching back and forth between the mallet head and the handle. To be able to fit what I'm going to be adding later, I need to add a tapered hole. So I'm switching to smaller and smaller drill bits, then with it open you can see that tapered hole leads to the dovetail. Yep, and that's why I need to be able to mark that handle, because now that hole will continue to taper through that handle. So this joint comes in handy because it gives me access. This first form of access is to be able to drill the holes, while the second form of access is to be able to install magnets. I know, this is getting YouTube-y real quick. Installing magnets in one of my tools. Well, yeah, I kind of need something metal to stay in place, and this is quite literally a perfect solution. But I think the smarter aspect here is how I'm making sure they stay in place, because these little guys are gonna be captive. I'm actually done with the smaller sized hole in the mallet. It was only there to mark the dovetail. And now you can see that those magnets aren't going anywhere. There's one last shallow hole to drill in the bottom of the handle. This will be for something special I make. At this point, the two halves still aren't glued together. They're either being held in place by that perfect dovetail or by double stick tape.
So while I have these two halves connected, I need to route a groove down this top, which will give me access to actually grabbing that
item that I will be inserting later. But I don't want my mallet dipping into the router table because I don't have a zero clearance for this size of router bit. So I'm making an exact fitting one by just overlaying a 1/4 inch piece of plywood. This groove kind of has a purpose, but it's mainly for looks. And square edges would be just fine, but if I chamfer those edges, then they'll match a lot of the other patterning that's happening, while also letting the light fall over the edges a lot more softly. Out of all of those cuts, I got one single tiny piece of tear out. And of course, it's not something I can just sand out, so I'm gonna patch that area, and as long as it looks invisible, then I'll be happy. If not, I'll redo it. The best way to clean up the chamfer of that patch is just by throwing it back on the router table, since it's already set up for that exact cut. But now I can add an additional mortise on top. The jig looks like it's just floating on top, but it's being held with double-sided tape. So I'm going really softly with the router bit, but this stuff holds pretty dang well. There's a link in the description. This oddly shaped mortise is actually more of a pocket, if anything. Its only purpose is to allow room for my fingers to grab a little handle. The cutest little handle you've probably ever seen, and you'll see.
All right, so that came out really, really nice, and I'm actually gonna add a little splash of color in there by inlaying a power shell.
I know this shell might look a little underwhelming right now, but trust me, it'll be shinier than a bald head at a beach party. Or at least that's what ChatGPT says, or apparently shinier than Grandpa's dentures after a deep clean. What the heck? ChatGPT, you are definitely the weirdest one here. To cut the power shell, I'm using a high tooth count blade that's designed for metals. I used to cut these things out by hand using a jeweler's saw, but this time I figured maybe just give a bandsaw a try. And to my surprise, it actually worked, I want to say perfectly, but I've said that a million times, so it worked flawlessly. I do know English if I give it some thought.
All right, the hardest part is always getting these things off without breaking them. Well, I couldn't have asked for a better fit. For now, I set the inlay aside so that I don't scratch it, and now I can cut ebony sides that will have a really, really cool texture.
This is some more of that beautiful B-grade ebony, and instead of leaving them flat panels, I'm gonna make a really, really cool diamond texture on them. So we're definitely transitioning into the realm of aesthetics rather than function at this point, but in a weird way, I kind of perceive beauty as a form of function, if that makes sense. The function is simple. It's to inspire someone to pick it up and use it. Which, by the way, this kind of reminds me of that fish instrument that nobody wanted in school, which I don't know why fish is a common theme in this video. Maybe my brain isn't functioning at its best and it's telling me I need my omega-3 fatty acids. Well, dang, that worked like a charm. I didn't know if it was going to work very well or not. My test, I did like one diamond. I didn't do a full sheet, but I'm pleasantly surprised. The diamonds came out very, very even. And I also show a lot more of this on Patreon, just as a reminder. I made these decorative panels too big so that I could figure out where the template fits nicely. And this might be confusing since it doesn't seem to match the mallet head, but I'm planning on going one step beyond the already beyond step I did, and then add another beyond step on that. So I really was serious at the beginning of this video when I said, we kind of do take things to the nth degree.
All right, those were a lot more work than I was expecting, but they're gonna be slapped on the outside of the mallet head like this. And notice how there's this blank spot. That's because I have a surprise. And that would be this veneer from my last video building the diamond table. It has some beautiful crotch grain and it'll be perfect for that spot.
I definitely could have just left it as the diamond accents. It would already be a really, really nice mallet. But remember the slanted piece of ebony in the handle? That will visually lead to this slant, or vice versa. This one will visually lead to that one. So in essence, they work together. They go hand in hand. I almost can't have one without the other. But the head is already made of walnut. Why am I adding another patch of walnut? And to that I say, because it's dope. If you watch a lot of woodworking YouTube videos, you might notice that most creators use Titebond 3, almost like it's a miracle glue and they can't use any other kind. Well, I used it for a lot of different things in this project, and there's a few things I like and a few things I don't like. One of the things that I do like is that it's a little bit thinner, so you can get your joints a little bit tighter, especially if it's a large flat surface and you're trying to squeeze out a lot of glue. But one thing I don't like is, since it is thinner, it tends to soak in more, which means I have to be a lot more careful to not create a glue-starved joint. So in other words, I have to use more of it, and in a lot of cases I have to put it on both surfaces, which you'll see in a minute. Another thing I do like is that it's not so viscous, so it spreads easier, which is helpful for speed, and given that it has a longer open time, it's just overall better for glue ups. But another thing I don't like is that it dries dark, and it causes glue staining a lot easier than other glues. So you'll see that I'm paying very close attention to clean as I go. I'm using a wet brush and making sure any squeeze out gets cleaned up right now rather than later.
All right, let's see how it did. Oh, I almost dropped it. Those joints came out perfect. Exactly what I wanted.
Circling back to the unsolicited glue conversation that no one asked for, I was just thinking, I wonder, since everybody has such strong opinions on glue, on whether it should be on both surfaces or not, if you should clean with water, or if that dilutes the glue and makes the staining worse, all sorts of things. Well, now I would put money on the fact that it's probably due to what glue each person is using. By the way, this ebony trim is the third above and beyond step. So now it's an honor to be able to split this thing apart, add some freaking glue, and get it glued together. Then I can finally divulge the secret tool that's going to be stored inside this mallet. By the way, thanks so much to the influx of patrons. You are freaking awesome.
All right, we got a full mallet. Let's see how she comes out.
To understand this choice, first we have to understand why I would want to put anything in a mallet in the first place. And it all boils down to this. When you're using a mallet, you're pretty much always using it with another tool. A chisel, holdfasts, carving gouges, or whatever tickles your fancy. Just keep that information to yourself. But what if you could store one of those tools in your main tool? then you would only have to grab one tool. That would have to save at least 10 seconds a day. And heck, over an accumulation of say 30 years, working 5 days a week, that's 78,000 seconds that this design saved you. You're welcome.
It smells like fish.
This tool will look like one tool, but serve the purpose of another. What it is essentially a scratch-all, but what I'm going to be using it for is a center punch. They're a little bit different in the fact that a center punch is a bit girthier to help withstand impacts into metal and such. But that girthier profile would have meant that I had to drill a bigger hole in the handle, and that would probably make it a lot weaker. So I settled on the nice petite profile of a scratch-all, and I'm just going to be using it as a center punch in wood, so it'll be fine. Now you can see by going back in time how it goes in and how the magnets hold onto it. But fast forward and we are ready for finishing. So now the secret is out, but there's kind of one important question that still remains. What if I'm using it one day and the punch flies out like a solid steel dart it is, and quickly becomes a weapon rather than an innocent woodworking tool? Well, we're testing that at the very end of the video, the last few clips. Stick around and you'll see. Remember this hole in the bottom of the handle? It's for the tiniest emblem I have ever made. And last, but certainly not least, remember that pop of color I wanted to add to the top? Well, she sells seashells by the seashore, and they look good. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to watch my videos.
All right, let's see if it's a weapon.
If I try really hard, I can get this thing to come out. But if I push it in pretty tight, oh.